Okay, so thank you very much, everybody, for joining the call. So my name is Tony TU. I'm the CEO of Renewables in Africa. And then today we're going to be talking about a new topic for the WiBA, which is what is best for Africa. And the topic is mini-grid in Africa. So how to best prepare for the Nigerian revolution. So I will start by saying that I need to describe very quickly to you what is the concept of WiBA. This is a new concept that we launched end of last year, and it's simply a forum for us to explore the opportunity or also challenges that the African continent face. And we're doing that specifically in two sectors. The renewable energy sector, but also African technology, against the backdrop of geopolitical events that are shaping our continent. So we talked about the trade deal all of last year. So talking about the various blocks that interact with Africa. And this year, we're starting with mini-grid. And we have very, very good attendance, I have to say. And I thank you very much for making the time to be here with us. So we have a full house, I would say: developers, investors, policymakers, technology suppliers, people from the civil society, and also academics. I'm almost gonna say, so if we are to start a mini-grid project today, we have all the skill needed to be able to make it happen, and it's just great to see. So jumping on into the topic of today, but first of all, let me just go through some house rules for us to understand how we're going to run this afternoon. So your camera has been turned off, all of you. So we're only going to be able to hear and see from the speakers in a minute. And then you're going to be able to ask questions on the chat. And then we're going to discuss that at the end of it to address those concerns or questions, simple questions that you have. And if you have feedback, more than happy for you to send it to us, source@renewablesinafrica.com. Last but not the least, I very much want you to enjoy yourself tonight. This afternoon. A very quick presentation of who is Renewables in Africa for those of you who have not come across us yet. So we are a clean energy engineering consultancy providing various services, so technical advice and capital raising support as well to our project developers. So we provide market insight and business intelligence to investors, and also we broker route to market for clean energy companies that are interested in African markets. And what makes us special, it's also that we are a media platform and we promote and raise awareness about the sector. And hopefully most of you have seen us before this event. So if not, feel free to get in touch with us. So this is my contact, and I'll be more than happy to talk to you more specifically about projects that we're doing in various countries: Zambia, Zimbabwe, Sierra Leone, and other initiatives. So today it's all about the mini-grid and the conversation that we're going to have. The first speaker that we have, it's a towering figure in the sector. So she is a lawyer. She has received the Eisenhower Award in 2015. And she's also the Nigeria campaign director for Power for All, so very important. And she owns and runs her company, Clean Technology Hub. So she'll be addressing you in the matter of policy and also rules that affecting the sector in Nigeria. So if Yoma, can you hear me? So if yes, can you unmute your mic, please, if you don't mind? And I'm going to also ask you to share your presentation. So I'm just going to stop mine. Yeah, so that I can make way for you.
Thank you, Tony. Just give us a to share us.
Yep, one second. Over to you, please.
Okay, good afternoon. My name is Ify, like Tony said, and I'll be walking through this very brief webinar with Chibike, my colleague, who also leads market access at Power for All, and is a founder of Bakersfield, one of the leading renewable energy companies in Nigeria. So we're going to be talking about mini grids specifically in the Nigerian context. And we want to look at what the drivers are for all of the mini grid revolution that's going on in Nigeria, what the trends are that we see, what the legislative and regulatory and policy environment is, what the economic indicators are showing, what challenges there might be, and what opportunities that there are for growth and for investments in the sector. So moving on very quickly, this is a slide that we like to talk through just to show you what the opportunity is in terms of the size of the market, having 75 million Nigerians unelectrified, 55% of them being energy poor, and with 70% of the entire country's population, energy poor population, living in rural communities. And we see that trend growing, that the unelectrified population has grown from 44 million just about 22 odd years ago to an increase of 70%. So that's just to show you the market size or the market opportunities that are present for mini grid development in Nigeria. So this is also a slide that we got from the Lighting Global Market Trends for 2018. And looking at it, you can see that Nigeria ranks second to India in terms of the potential for household, renewable energy sources. And even with India now beginning to accelerate its decentralized renewable energy opportunities, we're looking at Nigeria as maybe soon to be the largest market in that trend. And that shows you again the framework for the mini grid opportunities that we have here, because again, a lot of those opportunities are in rural communities and underserved areas, places where you don't have a lot of electricity. Now, to talk a bit about the electrification economics that we have in Nigeria, we have a mix of electricity opportunities currently in Nigeria. We have the grid, which is not functioning as it should. And this is what has created the opportunity for mini grids and standalone home solar systems. And in the past 3 to 5 years, we've seen the market for mini grids and standalone home systems actually accelerate. Many companies, many communities, and many individuals are tailoring their needs to each location, wherever it is they live in, whether it's in rural communities, peri-urban communities, or even in urban communities that are not well served by the grid. And the type of income that you see in those communities to decide what kind of electricity solutions are best suited for their context. And in terms of the technology types, we see that solar has at least 80% of the market share, but we see a lot of mini hydro projects and wind hydro projects that are already coming up also in the country. So what people are basically looking for is how to get the fastest electricity connection on time and the least capital intensive to be able to achieve that access. In terms of, the cost of energy solutions, you can see this slide, which shows the cost of national grid extension. If you see the one for the national grid extension, and you can see how it's rising versus the one for solar, diesel, biomass mini grids, which is the decentralized renewable energy systems. And you can see how it's accelerated over time versus the solar home systems and the pico solar systems, the smaller systems, which seem to be having some sort of parity with grid connection at the moment. So we definitely see that the hydro mini grids, solar home systems are actually the ones that are beginning to take off in the Nigerian market in more significant ways. And this is obviously because of some of the things that we just mentioned. People are looking for the cheapest, most cost-effective, and easiest way to get energy access immediately. The technology and cost of grid extension over the years hasn't really changed much. The cost of transformers and wires and poles, in fact, have continued to rise. Comparatively with solar panels, LED lightnings, charge controllers, even the batteries, used lead acid batteries, the costs of those things have continued to reduce. So we see that it's becoming more and more cheaper to actually acquire solar home systems or solar products than it is to actually wait for the grid extension to get to your home or to get to your community. Again, the other thing is speed and then cost. The average time it takes to build a power plant, at least this is a World Bank statistics, is 10 years. The average time for new transmission and distribution projects is 3 to 5 years. But you know, a lot of the developers that we work with in Nigeria actually are able to deploy mini grids and microgrids between 9 to 18 months. So you can see that the life cycle for a mini grid development or a mini grid deployment is it's minimally almost 90% shorter than it would take to have the grid get to your homes or your community. So that's a factor that is playing in the way people are deciding to adopt mini grid deployments in their communities or their home. Also, we've talked a lot about the costs and the technology, that they continue to fall. And so this is making it easier as an option for many governments, many local communities, and many homes. Some of the key takeaways here is that a lot of the off-grid energy areas that we have in Nigeria are very diverse. Nigeria is a very large country, and in fact, we call it different countries in one. So you have the northern part of the country that has very high solar irradiation, where you see a lot of the current mini-grid developments taking place. And then you see in the south, where you have a lot of density, and you know, a lot of also grid penetration in those areas, but many of those areas, despite the grid penetration, continue to be underserved. So every unelectrified community or area in Nigeria has a unique profile. But the thing that is underlining most of them is in terms of building access to energy in those communities or those homes, people keep continuing to talk about what's the least cost and fastest way to get them energized or to get electricity access into their homes and communities. One of the things that we have found is that in dealing with rural communities and rural households, sometimes because of how, especially in the north, how arid that area is, it can be unprofitable to service with the traditional grid. So we find that, you know, the best way to do that is through isolated mini grids or microgrids. And then you see that in the south, where you have underserved areas that you can find, and where the grid has penetrated, but the people are still underserved by that grid, that you have an opportunity for interconnected mini grids. So the DRE technology performance and costs, while improving, the communities themselves are actually creating the sort of framework that would allow different types of business models or different types of mini grid and microgrid technologies be deployed in those communities. So here, very quickly, again, are the drivers. It's the people want electricity and they want it now. We hear that everywhere we go. People don't want to wait. Nigeria is a signatory to the Paris Agreement. And there's been a lot of work that's been done by the federal government of Nigeria outside of setting large, ambitious targets in trying to sensitize the community and the people about what those climate goals are. And some of them have a direct link to how we actually use electricity. Everybody here knows a lot of the problems we've had with the oil and gas industry or with the fossil industry. So some of those conversations are some of the things that are driving people to look at, you know, off-grid technologies, especially mini grids and standalone home systems as options. There's a big push towards reverse migration in Nigeria. People want to actually live and work where they come from. So there's a huge push by the government around rural development. And here is where we begin to talk about productive use. How do we make sure that in those rural communities that we're building economics of impact, where people can actually build cottage industries that can actually help them feed their families and send them to schools. And so that's what's beginning to shift not just the global conversations around decentralized renewable energy in Nigeria, but also some of the local conversations. And of course, Nigeria wants to have some level of energy security where people know that, you know, a lot of their energy sources aren't just dependent on a grid that is very unstable. So here is the trend of what has happened with the mini grid revolution in Nigeria so far. I'm just going to skip to 2017. You might be aware that the World Bank has recently granted to Nigeria 350 million rural electrification facility. They are running this fund through the Rural Electrification Agency in Nigeria, and some of that is for the renewable energy sector. Some of that money is also for the grid connected sector. But the ones that are for the renewable energy sector is specific only to the mini grid sector, which is why this is interesting. And what this fund will do for a lot of the mini grid developers is that it's just going to help them access more funding, which is why a lot of the developers in Nigeria came together and actually launched the African Mini Grid Developers of Nigeria, the African Mini Grid Developers Association, the Nigerian chapter, so that they can actually all work together in terms of how to access the World Bank funding and make sure that they're meeting the World Bank's requirements to access the funding. There is a mini grid investment report that was launched late last year, and it's online. We're happy to share the link with you. That was a collaborative report by the Nigerian Renewable Energy Roundtable, the Nigerian Economic Summit Group, and the Rocky Mountain Institute in Colorado. And they assessed 10 commercial mini grid sites in Nigeria, and they estimated that those mini grid sites are able to reach a 99% collection rate. In other words, not only are people able to pay for the energy that they're receiving from the mini grids in those communities, they are willing to pay. So it's both the ability to pay and the willingness to pay that the report actually validated. And this was a source of comfort for a lot of investors that are beginning to look at the mini grid market in Nigeria. And in 2019, just a week ago, the first beneficiaries of the Rural Electrification Fund were announced. There were 12 developers, most of them were local. So that was a huge boost to the sector to see that the fund has really taken off and that people are able to access funding. There is a mini grid regulation in Nigeria which defines what a mini grid is and says that it's an integrated local generation distribution system that has to be below 1 megawatts. And that can serve numerous end users. We've talked about it being both isolated and interconnected, and with the ability to reduce grid dependence. Finally, before I hand over to Chibike, GIZ estimates that over 26 million Nigerians can be effectively provided with energy access using mini grid systems. And these statistics just tells you the potential and the opportunities in the market and what this can, and the investment portfolio, which is put at about $4 billion for people who want to come into the market. So there is huge opportunity there. I mean, just even in terms of how this can catalyze other sectors, other associated sectors outside of the electricity and energy access sector. We know that with the advent of the mini grid revolution in Nigeria, that more and more developers keep knocking down our doors to say, how do we come into Nigeria and tap into this opportunity? At this point, I'm going to hand over to Chibike to talk us through the rest of the slides and tell you, what the regulation says and what you need to do to apply and how you need to come into Nigeria if you decide that you want to come and do a mini grid investment. Chibike.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the webinar. Thank you, Ify, for kicking off the presentation. So I'm just going to go through. Yes, I'll just continue from where Ify stops, talk a bit about the current status, and then go into the policy framework, tariff issues, finance, opportunities, stakeholders in the Nigerian mini grid market. So there's a growing local expertise. Ify mentioned about the Nigerian chapter of AMDA that was launched, and we have an inflow and increasing number of local developers coming into the space. And from the reports, currently mini grid tariffs are cost reflective, So they are cost competitive with and even cheaper than alternative sources like small scale diesel and petrol generators. And most mini grids from the report and most commercial viable mini grids are usually located at, in communities that have productive use mainly towards agriculture. They have some level of so for anchor loads as well, and usually communities that have between 300 to 500 households. So this is just like a general average of the commercially viable mini grids in the country and the communities that where these systems are deployed. In terms of policy, I'm sorry, this slide you might not be able to see some of the key, some of the text there, but it's just to show the policies in the country so far that support off-grid electrification. But the two main ones are the mini grid regulation and the rural electrification strategy and implementation plan, RESIP. So I'm just going to go down and focus on the mini grid regulation, which is which more or less like covers and regulates mini grids in the country. So it's designed to accelerate the unserved and underserved areas, especially rural and peri-urban communities. And the regulation incentivizes and minimizes the major risks that's associated with mini grid investments. It simplifies the process for private sector participation in our electricity market, and then just more or less like about to grid extension, increasing profitability of loss-making areas. So, for example, communities where it'd be expensive for the discos to serve, where discos are more or less like make losses. So here you have the mini grid regulations that can cover that. So going the regulation also covers mini grids below 1 megawatt, and you have there are two categories there, up onto 100 kilowatt, and then between 100 kilowatt to 1 megawatt, and then this between these capacities shows how you can apply for licenses or permits with our regulatory body. So the regulation covers license, permits application, issues around tariff, relationship between the DISCO, that's the distribution company, who have more or less like rights over those areas, and the developer, the structure and arrangements. It covers issues around installation and maintenance, quality of service, safety and environmental protection, dispute resolution, especially with local communities. It encourages the use of renewables on a small scale, especially for productive use. And then it also allows for 12 months exclusivity period for mini grid project development. So basically, as a developer, once you identify a community, you have a 12-month period to develop there. So that addresses issues around competition and all that. In the regulation covers isolated mini grids. So those are purely off-grid mini grids in communities where there are no grid connection, and then interconnected mini grids where the mini grid is interconnected with the national grid in that area, mainly underserved locations. And the process mainly for applying for the permit for isolated mini grids. First one, you have to identify the site, establish a good relationship with the community, then sign a 12-month exclusivity agreement with the community. And then you have to do stuff around getting the required permits in terms of land, environmental safety, and health issues. And then make an application to NERC for permits. Permits are usually required for mini grid capacities between 100 kilowatt and above, and then below 100 kilowatts, you can just register with NERC. That is the Nigerian Electricity Regulatory Commission. So you don't need to apply for permit for mini grids below that capacity, and then you just install, commission, and operate. This is quite detailed in terms of the permit requirements. So you have to first of all get the application form, have the agreement with the community as a developer. Then you have to submit to NERC, who will now evaluate your application. You have to get a written consent from the distribution company of the intended areas, because DISCOs always have to submit a 5-year expansion plan to the regulatory body. And so you have to make sure that the location where you've identified, whether it falls within this 5-year, the area that the DISCO intends to expand into in the next 5 years or not. You have to show proof that the location is unserved and unassigned to any other developer, and they have to show proof around land acquisitions, technology, and other necessary permits like the environmental and health and safety assessment. And then the tariff for the mini grids which you will charge is based on the multi-year tariff methodology of NERC. And then for isolated mini grids up to 100 kilowatts, a permit is optional. So you can decide to get a permit to develop a mini grid up to 100 kilowatt, or you can just simply register with the Nigerian Electricity Regulatory Commission for that. So it's not mandatory. So mini grid developers looking to install systems within that capacity have these two options. For interconnected mini grids, it's different. So you have to identify the site, mostly an underserved location, have an exclusivity agreement, and then you also have to have a tripartite agreement between the developer, the community, and the DISCO, agree on network usage fees and conditions, approve, and then obtain an approval from NERC after submitting all these documents, and then it's about installing and operating the mini grid. The permit requirements for interconnected mini grids, an application form, so you complete it and send it to the commission. The proposed retail tariff, which is also calculated under the MITO methodology as stipulated in the mini grid regulation, and has to be agreed between the developer, the community, and the distribution company. And then NERC will have to approve it. And then the execution of this of the contract between the three parties as well. Now, in issues of tariff, like I mentioned earlier, that right now, over the past few 5-6 years, that many grids have taken off. Costs have become cost reflective. So we've had a transition from pilot projects towards projects now that are just purely commercial. And in terms of the tariff structure, the tariff, like I mentioned earlier, is calculated using the MITO methodology. They are subject to technical and non-technical losses of a maximum of 10% each. For permit holders, mainly for those who are installing mini grids above 100 kilowatt, the tariff is subject to review based on an application by a permit holder or an inspection of accounts by an authorized persons. Then for those for the mini grid developers who have mini grids below 100 kilowatt, you have two options. So the first one, you can decide to have the tariff based on the MITO methodology, or you can simply have an agreed tariff between yourself and the community. But the tariff has to be agreed by at least 60% of the community. So, and then NERC will also have to look at the tariff, the agreed tariff, which could be subject to intervention, where the rate of return exceeds typically non-recourse commercial local currency debt by 6%. And in the policy, there are a few other things there as well. There's network usage charge, which is agreed between the mini grid developer and the DISCO, and issues around how that can be resolved as well. Other provisions in the mini grid policy are issues around compensation. So, for example, if you have a mini grid in a location, and then eventually the DISCO now decides to extend the grid network to that area, how is the mini grid developer compensated? How are the assets evaluated, and make sure that he has a fair compensation? Or what kind of agreement does he have to go with the developer, since these are long-term projects? So the regulation also addresses this. Issues around compliance requirements, accounting requirements, environmental protection requirements, health and safety requirements, insurance, reporting, and technical requirements as well. So the few challenges were because, like I just mentioned, the mini grid regulation was launched in 2017, so it's still a fairly new regulation, and it's just in the process of being implemented. And as expected, there'll be areas where probably like challenges will come up, but then most of the challenges that have been identified are being sorted out and being addressed. Some of the key ones to highlight, so if you have intention of coming to the country to make investments and you're the developer, so the challenges with the policy, but which are being addressed, are limitations as to generation capacity. So because of the fact that you don't really have to apply for a permit and go through the process of getting a permit if you're deploying mini grids below 100 kilowatts, we see that most of the mini grid developers are actually deploying systems below that capacity just to simplify the process. Then also the issues around uncertainty as to the DISCO's expansion plans and grid extension. So also the process of the mini-grid developer meeting the DISCO to say, oh, can I see your expansion plans and how do we work that out? So there are uncertainties around that, and mostly based on your relationship with the DISCO. Then the compensation mechanism as well, but like the market is fairly new, so we haven't gotten to that stage yet. But at this moment, also issues around resolving that so that you're very sure that you'll be compensated should the DISCO decide to go into that area as well. Issues around permits to obtain land and other technical issues are there as well. Then issues around the EIA ambiguity. So the EIA process as well. So if you're deploying a mini grid, for example, a 50 kilowatt mini grid, and someone else is deploying a mini grid of 500 kilowatt, you guys have to go through the same hurdle, the same process. So there are issues around the ambiguity about the EIA and how does it apply to specific capacities to make it very easy and cheaper. And then issues around technical requirements. As regarding the EIAs, those issues are being resolved at the moment between the REA, that's the Rural Electrification Agency, with the Ministry of Environment as well, to come up with like a very more polished way of environmental protection provisions. Then comes to finance. So I'm going to focus here now more on the commercial mini grids than the pilot. We see mostly a mix of debt and equity in the 70% in that ratio of debt and equity, and then supplemented with grant funding too. So the grant funding can be used to sort out issues around EIA and all those kind of things as well, to make it much more attractive. And we have an inflow right now of several sources of finance into the mini grid sector. We have from the Rural Electrification Fund, which Ife earlier mentioned has the first 12 beneficiaries have been selected and going through the process of deploying mini grids. We have funds from multilateral finance institutions like the World Bank. We also have from climate funds, private impact investments. A few of the commercial banks also are unlocking local funding for the sector, and a lot of mini grid developers also have accessed finance from crowdfunding platforms. The government in this allocation, annual allocation for constituency projects, there's also finance for projects that can be used in different communities by federal legislators, and that can also be used also in terms of driving energy access in those communities. I'll focus a bit on the Rural Electrification Fund. It provides capital subsidies through grants, technical assistance to supplement the private investment. So the the fund subsidizes more or less like the private investment into the sector. So if you're coming, for example, to bid to power a rural community, and you're going to and you're working with the REA, you can either come maybe through solicited bidding, where you more or less, so the REA has a specific fund, and then both local and international companies lobby for that fund. But for foreign companies, you mostly have to partner with the local companies when mostly in order to increase your chances of accessing the solicited funds, or more unsolicited bidding, where you more or less like you have the funding and you're just looking for enabling environment. And we also have seen in the sector more innovative finance models like the split asset model, where the developer owns the generation source, and then maybe the government or some other body takes care of the distribution and other ends of the project. And then we've seen a lot of commercial debts have been obtained mainly through concessional loans and impact investments. Many grid developers report 15 to 20% return on successful projects so far. So also to highlight the $350 million World Bank Investment Fund. So the fund is expected to leverage about $1 billion in private sector investment. Out of the $350 million, $150 million for that is dedicated to mini grids, which has, and also more or less like to leverage private sector opportunity of up to $300 million as well. Under the $150 million, you have $70 million for competitive bidding for portfolios of mini grid sites. Already, the REA has done a very brilliant work in terms of going to communities to gather data, identifying potential off-grid communities, and already they have about 100 pre-selected sites up for auction. and an additional 70 plus in high risk environments. So areas mostly like in the north where there are security challenges, issues. And then the other component of the 150 million is 80 million, which will more or less like be given to mini-grid companies based on connection. So you get about $300 plus for each new connection, but then that will be verified. And the 100% payment made after the connection. So that's just to make sure that when you're deploying your mini-grids, you're actually going out to connect to to more households there. So that fund is also meant to like subsidize that cost as well and make it more attractive for mini-grid developers. They're in the first mover potential in the next 5 years. We have about 300,000 households and 30,000 SMEs that can be served by 1,000 mini-grids. So some challenges with developers. The mini-grid sector is still new, despite all the progress that has been made in this short period. It's still new, and more or less like developers are still understanding the field and all that. So some of the key challenges for developers are the limited track record, which inhibits their ability to access funds, especially commercial funding. Mini-grids are capital intensive, definitely. So it's also a challenge as well for local developers, especially to get the kind of money they'll need locally for that. Also trying to mitigate issues of forex. Then unfamiliarity of banks with the sector and high collateral requirements, limited credit history of enterprises, because these enterprises serve rural areas, and these rural dwellers mostly don't have any credit history as well in terms of how to use that to access funds. Minimal experience as well. But what we're saying is a gradual transition from pilot projects towards commercially viable mini-grid projects. So just to highlight, I think I have just 2 or 3 more slides to go, and then I can take questions and Ify. To highlight the opportunities in the mini-grid market. Currently, Nigeria has the largest proven commercially viable mini-grid market in Africa, with a revenue potential of $8 billion annually. The government has set its goal to get to have 10,000 mini-grids by 2023, an ambitious target, but with the level of progress in the sector in terms of the number of sites that have been identified, so more or less like much more demand than supply, the level of finance coming into the sector and increasing level of experience in deploying mini-grids, the potential is huge there. There's a growing inflow of commercial and local finance from some of the institutions that I mentioned earlier. Then scaling the mini-grid market to this 10,000 mini-grids, and let's assume 100 kilowatt capacity by 2023, would power 14% of the population and create a $20 billion investment opportunity, generating over $3 billion in annual revenue. Right now, mini-grids tariffs, so it's not an issue of whether the tariffs are high and if the rural dwellers cannot afford it. Prices currently are cost competitive, and developers have recorded between a 98% to 100% collection rate in communities where we have these commercial mini-grids deployed. With or without a key anchor client, mini-grids in the country are capable of achieving operating margins as much as 30% in revenue. We have a lot of stakeholders in the sector, a lot generally in the decentralized renewable energy space, and then select number in the mini-grid space. We have the Rural Edification Agency, which is driving the advancements of mini-grids to rural communities. We have the Nigerian Electricity Regulatory Commission, which more or less is in charge of implementing the regulation. We have development and donor organizations who have provided tremendous technical and financial support in the sector, USAID, Power Africa, GIZ. We also have an oversight from the leading agency in the power sector, the Federal Ministry of Power. We have our key the African Mini-Grid Developers Association, the Nigerian chapter, where with the numbers growing in terms of local developers coming into the sector. We have Power for All that leads in terms of market access and development and research and advocacy as well in the sector. You have other institutions like the Nigerian Renewable Energy Roundtable, Nigerian Economic Summit Group, and support in terms of data from organizations like the Rocky Mountain Institute. So yeah, so that's it. At this point, I hope the presentation so far has touched on all the key areas. The sector is huge and big, and a whole lot more details and information in terms of the different slides and areas that I touched on. But I hope this provides like a comprehensive summary and an overview of the market so far. If you want much more detailed information, you can always reach Ify and myself via email as well. And the slides will be sent out updated with more or less like some sources of some references and sources as well. So at this point, I could be open to take any questions as well. Tony, I think I'll hand over to you at this point.
Yes, Thibaut, that's great. Can you hear me? If you keep sharing your slide, please, because I suspect there might be some questions, and then I want to make sure that you are able to go back to a specific slide if that's the case. So first of all, thank you very much for a very insightful conversation and presentation here. We have roughly about 15 minutes for questions. And at this point, I would say if there is any question in the floor, so please send that in the chat to me, and I'll be relaying that to Thibaut Kim and Ifeoma. So first of all, I will kick off having that, let's say, pleasure to be the host here. So you talked about a sector that has a lot of potential, and you talked about the targets. I want to talk about the elephant in the room here. So we know Nigeria will be going into election this year, and a lot of what is happening because a lot of the content was around the policy. And I was actually wondering, so how election, not only the presidential, but also the government elections will potentially impact the sector, or is there any impact at all, do you see? Any of you, whether you, Thibaut, or Ify, so just wanted to get out of our way first.
Yeah, I mean, so I think there are two things. I mean, the political risks, I think, are minimal. There is an election, a presidential and a gubernatorial election coming up in February and March. But in terms of how that impact, and of course, because of that election, and because it's going to be very contentious from everything we see, we do know that people are adopting a bit of a wait and see attitude to see, who wins, and depending on who wins, whether there's going to be any changes in terms of the policymakers. But we do not expect the regulatory environment to be impacted. The regulator is independent. We do have a mini-grid regulation that sets out the parameters of how the sector is supposed to operate. Everything from the investments, everything from the mini-grid deployment, everything from how they work with the communities, how they work with the distribution companies, everything is contained in that regulatory document. That document isn't going to change anytime soon. It's one of the best regulations we have for mini grids globally. Yes, there could be some improvements in some places, but it's not going to change. So that's going to remain. The regulator's office is also independent. They have a 5-year tenure. So irrespective of who comes in, that tenure isn't going to be impacted. They would have to finish their tenure anyway, which I think for the current team, ends about 2 or 3 years from now. So that we don't expect that there's going to be any sort of radical, upheaval in the mini grid sector as a result of an election. That, things are a bit steadier than people seem to anticipate.
Okay, that's great. So I have received a question for you, which is basically asking whether the target that has been set, do you personally think that it is achievable, or is just another one of those politician promises? I know it's a bit tricky question, so yeah, but it would be good to hear from you.
So I would love to even know who's asking that question, because maybe that might also give me some context. I
think I would rather protect the person, but...
It's okay. So to be honest, I think, the Rural Electrification Agency has put out a target of 10,000 mini grids by 2023. I think it's doable if you look at like how long it takes to deploy a mini grid regulation. And just this year, they just gave tender documents to about, the first tranche of companies, developers that they want to go deploy mini grids as part of their mini grids strategy. And I think this is just the first tranche. I think there's another one coming up in a few months. I think it is doable. Whether we would reach that 10,000 by 2023, we might fall short maybe by a few, but I think we'll be close, especially if they continue with the momentum that they've had for the past 2 years. So it's not just an arbitrary government, target that has been put out there. I don't know if Chibike has anything to add to the conversation.
Yes, I think that covers it really. I think in terms just the issue. So in terms of the market, in terms of we have the communities that can take in those 10,000 mini grids. Yes, is there like a very promising inflow of finance in the sector that can do that? Yes. Are we going to scale up fast enough to have maybe like much more number of developers that can deploy at the scale that is required fast enough to those sites with much more experience to deploy maybe like 100 mini grids at the same time, 10 and all that? So that will be the more question, the contentious part here. The issue will be more or less like how fast can we actually deploy that? Looking at the market, because the market is there, the communities are there. A lot of developers have already gone out to identify, have like a huge portfolio of communities that are just waiting for mini grids. They are just waiting to access the financing to do that. So the market is there. We can meet 10,000 or even more, but can we move as fast enough with the number that should require? Looking at the capacity of the developers, the number, and other factors like that. That might be the issue in terms of reaching the target. But definitely, I think it's doable if if all the factors are in place.
Okay, that's great. So I have another 2 questions for you. So just to remind the floor, so we get about 10 minutes left, so we might go over for a minute or two, but after that we need to ram down. So the second question the next question that I receive is, obviously there's a 2-part question. So according to you, what would be the best business model to apply for mini grid in Nigeria, and how do we achieve profitability? So that's the first question. The second question is talking about the grid expansion plan. So when the policy was designed, is it a match with the mini grid? Because sometimes one of the key questions in the sector is what is happening for the mini grid when the grid comes. So if you can tackle those two, you can take one each if you want. And that'd be quite good.
Let me take the second one, because I think that's a question that's continuously reoccurring. The mini grid regulation answers that. And so as a start, I encourage everybody who wants to do mini grid development or investments in Nigeria to actually get a copy of that regulation. It's online. It's downloadable. It's a PDF copy at www.nec.gov because it completely answers all of these questions. The regulation says that, when first of all, the DISCOs, the distribution companies, have to submit their 5-year expansion plans. And this is so that the mini grid developers know what those expansion plans are and how to set, this would inform the mini grid developers' site selection when they're thinking of scoping out sites or even deciding on where to build a mini grid. But even more so is the fact that the regulation also says that if there is a mini grid that has been deployed and then the grid is expanding to that area, it asks that the distribution company, there's a fixed model assets calculation that they put in the regulation that says that the DISCO has to compensate the mini grid developers. I've forgotten how the calculations are done. I don't have it off the top of my head. But for his assets, Or the two of them, both the mini-grid developer and the DISCO, can actually reach an agreement about whether the mini-grid developer can continue to service those areas through either an interconnected mini-grid agreement or through some sort of other split shared assets model, something. But it actually addresses some of these issues that are coming up that keep coming up in terms of questions about when there's grid parity in an area where there's already a mini-grid development. The regulation already answers all of those questions.
Okay, and the first questions, what about the business model profitability? It can be a short answer because I want to take two questions after that before we close. So I was looking at what is the best business model and the profitability. Yeah, go Chibu.
Yeah, sure. In the slide, I mentioned that most developers are deploying 70-30 debt equity ratio and looking at financial models such as the split asset model, which is mostly used where they just own the generation part and then some other organization or company handles the distribution part. So that's one of the key models that is being used in the sector right now. And over time, I know as the market progresses, there'll be a bit much more flexible business models there. There are questions around in terms of having mini-grids be commercially viable, would there always be grants? Well, I think to some extent there might be some grant components to always take care of issues like maybe site assessments and EIAs and the rest of that. Because if you look generally in the electricity market globally is subsidized really. But the mini-grid market in Nigeria has proven to be like the largest, has proven to be largely commercially viable. I mentioned the collection rates but no issues so far. So in terms of the business model that's deployed currently, that will be the split asset model, and that 70-30% ratio between debt and equity.
Okay, thank you for that. Great. So last two questions to finish. So for all these mini-grid projects, so where do we get funding for projects? And also, will local banks support projects? Very important for me, actually, local bank. Because it's not just about getting money from somebody else, right? Yeah, so what would you say?
Yeah, sure. So somewhere in the slide, I mentioned sources of funding right now. So we have funding with the REA, that's Rural Electrification Fund. We have that funding from the World Bank. We have funding from private investors as well. A few commercial banks are also looking into the sector as well, on looking at unlocking commercial finance for the sector. So we also have, in terms of accessing climate funds as well. I think the first step really for any developer that's looking to come to the sector and access finance should be, so you're looking to deploy a mini-grid in the country, fine. How can you personally, through unsolicited bidding, what are the potential sources? A few companies locally have been able to access funding through crowdfunding platforms as well, like Betavest as well. So there are lots of these sources of funding from MFIs, from the government as well, and from private funds. I mentioned basically just to know exactly what these specific fundings are, but there are quite a lot of sources of funding for the sector, really. Okay,
and including local bank?
Including local bank, well, we haven't quite seen any funding so far from local banks, but like I said, banks like Sterling Bank, for example, has been taking a lot of interest into the sector, but across the value chain of the decentralized renewable energy sector. So that includes solar home systems and mini-grids as well. We're yet to see any commercial funding that has been approved so far from commercial banks, but looking at how banks were more or less like not looking at the market a year, 2-3 years ago, there's a lot of interest, but it's focused more on understanding the business models, understanding more or less like the nature of the market first, and then now structuring financing to fit the financial requirements of the market and also what the commercial banks can do. So no, so far, not yet, but we anticipate local funding instead of local commercial banks.
Okay, great. So last question from me. So this is coming from Renewables in Africa, Ife, so that you know. Okay, capacity building. It's something that's very, very important for me because it's about building as well local skills, right? Because one of the issues you want to drive down the cost is to make sure that there is a local supply chain that can take on those projects. So what is done to accompany the policy to make sure that there is a local Nigerian supply chain that can actually grow the sector?
So I'll speak to two specific initiatives that are ongoing. Power for All recently launched a Powering Jobs campaign, and that Powering Jobs campaign is looking at how, there are three aspects to the campaign. One of them is looking at how to collect data on the possible direct and indirect jobs that can emanate from the decentralized renewable energy sector, with the mini-grid being a focal point of that research. But secondly, also to do a skills gaps assessment to see what skills are missing. And then thirdly, to begin to look at how to address those skills gaps. But on the other hand, there's several trainings that are ongoing with GIZ and several local partners on teaching and training technicians. Most of them last for about a month to 3 months, 6 months, on how to become mini-grid developers. They're doing mini-grid trainings, mini-grid investments, mini-grid deployments, training engineers on how to deploy mini-grids. So these are all ongoing at the moment. These are just two initiatives. Beyond that, there's also, is there another one I'm missing? There are also several other, with the USAID initiative, there are some USAID initiatives where they've done a lot of work on TVET. So these are,
okay.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay.
Yeah, so there are several initiatives going to address the skills gap.
Okay, that's very good to hear. Because I think this is something we should never forget about, because it's about building a new industry, and to sustain that industry, it's important to have the right people that can develop this opportunity, and to make sure as well that not everything goes into foreign company, although foreign company are needed, and it's good to have them on board as well. But it's about as well developing the local supply chain, as I mentioned. So yes, so this was a very interesting conversation. So I would like to thank everybody for attending, and especially our two speakers today, Sefiona Malo and Chibike Agbaibu. And we're going to have much more conversation on WiBA in the coming month. And then at this point, I would like to run a very quick survey that might actually reach you. So it will take about 20 to 30 seconds to complete that, please. So that tell us roughly whether we've been able to reach our objectives. So if not, we obviously address that later. Okay, people have started doing that, great. So we'll give you another 10, 15 seconds, and after that. And in the meantime, keep supporting us. So send us message if you want to engage renewables in Africa for your project, and don't hesitate to get in touch. And yes, so at this point, I will stop the poll now. Polling. Okay, let's stop. So we're going to share results. Okay, so I can see you have enjoyed your webinar. So did I. I can only say thank you very much for joining. So we should have our next topic for next month soon. And then I wish you a good rest of the afternoon or the morning, depending where you're joining from. And then I'll speak to you shortly. Thank you again, Ify. Thank you, Chibu. And then this is only the start of our great conversation. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.